Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Weekend Rockstars, your favourite podcast for music, tips and tricks and everything in between. Here at the Weekend Rockstars, one of the things we pride ourselves on is discussing the things as musicians that we're left to intuit. You know, there's a lot of formal music education you can get, but along the ways, there are things that you just have to pick up. You know, how do you book a gig? How do you make a set list? All these little in-between things we love to cover here. And also, every now and then, we love to get deep into a really nerdy subject, especially when it's got something to do with music, because that's what we do here. So I'm really pleased this week to be joined by a good friend of mine, Mr. Jimmy Kent. Jimmy, say hello.
Hi, everyone.
And so Jimmy's going to introduce himself to you guys in a second. I met Jimmy at an open mic night in the local area in July 2022. And me and Jimmy proceeded to hang out shortly after that, and we jammed. And what I say we jammed, we mostly talked about nerdy stuff.
Pretty much Marvel and Star Wars for 4 hours.
It was great, and we've done some recording over the last year together as well, which has been really great. And recently Jimmy has been playing bass for my backing band, the Tokyo Sex Whales. We did a show recently, which was really, really fun. And Jimmy, please tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah. Well, hi, guys. My name is Jimmy Kent. I have a degree in songwriting from Belmont University in Nashville and a degree in philosophy from the University of Warwick with a focus on aesthetics and ethics, which hopefully situates me well for this conversation. I've also spent a fair chunk of my life in tech and computers and the internet, and thanks to growing up in a very technological household. My father's the founder of 3D Labs, one of the pioneers in the 3D graphics space. So, my personality was set very early. My three earliest memories are singing Frank Sinatra in the car with my dad, which I now basically do professionally, going around nursing homes, especially for Alzheimer's and dementia patients, and singing rap act and rock and roll or traditional music. And then the second one was being dropped at the Crash in Kingston, and they had Mario on the original NES. It's the first time I played a computer game. I was like 3 or 4 years old, and now a lifelong gamer. And then the third one was getting sent home from preschool for biting a kid for messing with a painting that I was doing. So very protective over artwork and not afraid to get into trouble.
Okay. Just a disclaimer, there won't be any biting in today's session.
I don't know, man. There'll probably be a lot of barking.
We should say brilliant. Thanks for that, Jimmy. So today we are going to be diving into the subject of artificial intelligence in songwriting, specifically in songwriting. There are so many different areas that artificial intelligence is touching right now. And as we record this is the 21st of December 2023, and as someone who goes online daily and looks at articles, watches videos, just the things that interest me that pop up on my feed or things I'm looking into, one of the big hot button topics this year has been AI in so many different areas, but obviously, specifically in music, there's been a lot of stuff that's come up this year. One of the big things that happened this year was the Beatles came back. Now and Then, their new track. They used AI to finish the track. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, there are multiple parts of that, right? Like, in terms of the process, I'm pretty in favor. If you listen to it as a sort of technical artifact of production, it's reasonably impressive. It's sort of clear. The video is as well. Having the ability to do that seems to me to be a useful tool in an artist's toolkit. Now, if you ask me what I think of it musically, I mean, to out my priors and probably drive half your audience firmly onto the decelerationist side, I'm not the biggest fan of the Beatles.
Heresy.
Yes, exactly. I like them mostly as songwriters, and then that's quite specific. But they're artists that I much prefer hearing being covered.
Interesting.
Along with to outrage the rest of the audience, Bob Dylan, Bob Marley, and a few others in there that I would rather hear their songs interpreted through people whose voices I find more palatable.
Okay, to put you on a spot for a second,
Yeah.
is there a cover of a Beatles song
Yes.
that you'd like to plug that you think is actually worth people's time?
Oh, okay, yeah. What would be the... Okay, I mean, there's a few I can think of, right? So there's the Fiona Apple version of Across the Universe, which
Great
is
song.
a glorious thing from, which I know from the film Pleasantville, which has a phenomenal soundtrack. And I think, subject for another podcast, but like the value of soundtracks and, as a vehicle for discovery of music is so insane and so underappreciated. So that one I really do enjoy. But no, 100% the best one. And I will take no comments. No, I'm joking. It is Boys to Men's version of Yesterday, which is pure a cappella and absolutely divine. Like,
Okay.
genuinely so gorgeous and so much more impactful for me than the original because of the quality of the harmonies. There's a lot of reharmonization, but obviously a lot more depth and height as well because of their kind of greater vocal ranges than the Beatles.
Of course, yeah. It's funny you should say the whole kind of boy band era of pop, of the the 90s going into the 2000s era. It's kind of an era that I've largely overlooked because at the time when it was coming out, it just didn't appeal to me. Now, recently I was drumming in a pantomime, Jack and the Beanstalk. One of the songs in there was Larger Than Life, Backstreet Boys.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard this song in a long time. And playing it through, actually a really cool song. I really enjoyed it. And it just made me think about how different music is today, pop music, compared to what it was 20, 25 years ago. It's crazy how much has changed. I hadn't thought about that much, but...
All right, let me tie that back in to AI, right? Because I think one of the most underrated elements of that, and I totally agree, even today, there are people sleeping on the Spice Girls. And the insane variation in quality in pop terms of the productions of their songs, right? And the reason that ties back in is because I was recently listening to the Ghostwriter AI sample of Drake and The Weeknd, which, quite apart from being, for me, a more enjoyable song than I've heard from either of those guys for quite a while, I think the reason that a track like that works... do you know the one I'm talking about?
I don't think I do, no. I'm aware of The Weeknd, but I...
So, basically, earlier this year, it's one of the other big AI controversies of this year, someone called Ghostwriter released an AI-created song that was a collaboration between an AI-generated Drake and an AI-generated Weeknd. The Weeknd.
Okay.
Without permission from either artist. But it blew up and kickstarted a whole debate about the ethics of what is and isn't copyrightable, all that kind of stuff. But for me, one of the most interesting aspects of it is I think that would be it would be a lot harder to do. Not that it would be impossible at all, especially there are some tools coming out that are going to get there, but it would be a lot harder to do to replicate that process with a Spice Girls song, for example, than with the dominant genres today, or specifically a genre like trap or or mumblecore, like the direction that a lot of mainstream rap has gone, because it is so repetitive and similar, and really just not innovating much at all. It is far easier to replicate with AI, and to not just replicate but to create things that are competitive or even superior, because the playing field is so much smaller, right? Like, whereas the amount of modulation or something that's going on in in like a classic Spice Girls song, right? I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them, there's really some pretty big swings in terms of, like, stuff you even wouldn't hear in a lot of like contemporary pop music.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's nothing. In the same way as lyrically, I can't remember the exact stat for this, but the reading level equivalent vocabulary of rap in the top 40 has diminished over time. So a smaller vocabulary is being used with a lot more repetition and things like that, like leaning into kind of the least sort of innovative elements of pop, right? That repetitive aspect. In the same way as that lyrical compression has happened, we've also had a musical compression, where music is sounding more and more similar, and that may also be a function of the limitations of copyright, because the more unique a progression or a lyric or anything like that is, the easier it will be to prove infringement. Whereas, if you're using like a standard blues variation or anything else that's been established to be like, this is broad enough that it's fair use, right?
Yeah.
Then you don't have that, like, so, but if you're doing 1-5-6-4, you're not going to get done, because that would topple the whole house of cards that is the current IP law.
Yeah. So I will, in that you gave a recommendation for a Beatles cover, there's a great act online, Postmodern Jukebox.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they do a great version of Wannabe, the Spice Girls song, in an old kind of 1940s kind of style to it, and it's beautiful. So one of the big things this year has obviously been songs in AI, and that there have been people taking, say, Kurt Cobain's voice and having him through AI cover a Soundgarden song. Now, this comes into kind of an ethical debate, because obviously Kurt Cobain has nearly been dead for 30 years, and someone is resurrecting his voice, or at least attempting to have him cover another song that came out around 30 years ago. What do you think of that? Do you think that's right? Do you think that should be allowed, or do you think anything's game?
I mean, firstly, side note, because it's funny, that his, I'm trying to remember which way around it is. I think his daughter is now dating Tony Hawk's son.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so it's difficult to, obviously, and again, a lot of this was thrown up by the Drake Weekend collab, right? Because both of them objected, as far as I recall, and understandably so, right? And there's an interesting disparity here between like visual arts and sort of music or audio arts, in terms of kind of the lassitude and whether you're in opt-in or opt-out systems for copyright. And this was a big part of the SAG-AFTRA strikes this year, right? because what the studios were doing, and this is a fair point on the side of the decelerationist who want to take time to put in regulation around AI, because corporations and industries can rarely be trusted to act in the public interest, right? But at the same time, they're putting forward a deal where extras in Hollywood would have a single opportunity, and when they would go in to do their extra work, they would then be digitized, and the studios would maintain their digitized version in perpetuity to use whenever they need to deploy extras and using AI to do it.
Yeah.
So that's one of the big things that the strike this year was designed to prevent.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
Scummy, if you ask me.
yeah. Again, I'm very much was in support of that as a not that as a policy, but the strike as a counter to that, because I mean whether or not you have the right to be an extra indefinitely, whether that should be a profession is one thing, but the idea that like the unequalness of those bargaining positions, and the idea that you could just forever own someone's digital image for a like one-time menial payment, like that doesn't sit well with me. But at the same time that they're doing that, like Disney specifically is also, and to be clear, I don't know whether Disney was one of the studios that was proposing that, but it wouldn't surprise me. But at the same time they're doing that, they're also negotiating with James Earl Jones, who, subsequent to recording his final work as Vader, or at least that's what he said, whoever retires in this day and age, especially in this instance, because at the same time as he was recording the end of that, he was negotiating with them to essentially take and digitize all of the work that he has done as Darth Vader, and for a presumably substantial sum, they are in perpetuity allowed to redeploy that. So James Earl Jones will forever be the voice of Darth Vader, or at least Disney has the option of making that. And on the one hand, from a liberal perspective, he's got the right to sell those rights, I think, in the same way as artists have the right to sell their catalogs, or try and buy their catalogs back. But on the other hand, is it right that future actors, right? I mean, think how many actors now have made their names on rebooting famous characters, right? Or incorporating famous characters, like Tom Holland. Where would Tom Holland be if only Tobey Maguire could ever be Spider-Man? Because he was digitized at the time, and then whenever they needed a new Spider-Man, they just roll out that. It's hard to know exactly where the line is, right, in terms of the rights that you have. So the reason I brought up visual arts is, in art, you can't copyright a style. So you can imitate someone's style as much as you like. But YouTube, for example, has just committed to, they brought in all these tools that make it much easier to remove, and I want to make sure I get the correct language on this.
Jimmy brought notes, everyone.
Oh yeah, always. So they're voluntary standards that they've introduced, that AI videos or AI generated content requires clear identification, and that there are tools, easy tools to remove content that, and this is the quote, simulates an identifiable individual, or, new quote, mimics an artist's unique singing or rapping voice, end quote, without permission. Which made me dive into a whole thing of, well, how many people's voices can actually be said to be unique, right? Because there are many, many singers in various genres that I think you could more or less swap in and out, and 90% of the public would not notice the difference.
Yeah.
Right. So there are whole legal standards around that, but YouTube is clearly taking that position. But at the same time, they've released this other tool which is not Lyria, which I find quite exciting, but I can't remember the exact name of it. Some sort of creative thing, but it's AI generated that basically you type in a prompt and then you pick the name of one of a small selection of artists that they have partnered with, and the prompt will generate 30 seconds of a song by that artist that subscribes to that prompt, whatever the subject would be, right?
Yeah.
So there are people like Demi Lovato and Charlie Puth, and I think T-Pain is one of them as well. And again, so they're doing the James Earl Jones thing, right? And they have the right to like sell their voices. And I think it probably is fair that you can't pass off, right? Like there are already laws against passing off. You can't take a thing and say, this is Charlie Puth if it's not Charlie Puth, right? But how far... I mean, before you get into the IP of fair use and transformative use and pastiche, like, at what level is it okay to commercialize someone else's voice without their permission? Which is the question you asked 10 minutes ago. But, like, I think that's all valuable context because I don't really know, right? I can see arguments sort of for and against, but I think a lot of it rests on transformative, and transformative is, as most fair use is, a thing that is decided ad hoc as you go. Like there isn't a real easy scalpel there that you can use to divide black and white. You know, there are, like, when I do the nursing homes, because it's December, I've been doing my Christmas gigs and my Christmas set list most days for the last like 3 weeks. And one of the songs I do is Walking in a Winter Wonderland, and I always have to be careful not to sing the Weird Al version, which is Walking Round in Women's Underwear. Because I heard that song way more growing up. I heard that version way more than the original.
Yeah.
Right?
I totally get you. I've got, so a couple months back, I did a parody of Park Life by Blur on my YouTube channel called Plant Life. And Park Life has been like a staple of my set for a while now. Even in my original set, I'll occasionally throw it in because I quite like it. And now whenever I sing Park Life, I have the lyrics to Plant Life going on in my head side by side at the same time. Yeah. And it's a real struggle to not sing those lyrics, especially seeing as I do the second verse of Plant Life in an Irish accent.
Oh, no.
You know, it's really hard to not go, you know. I get up when I want, except on Wednesdays. I'm rudely awakened by the dustman.
Man.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Yeah, it's a tough old debate with singers who are no longer around, and now people are just, you know, willy-nilly kind of throwing an AI version of them on a track, you know, on YouTube. If they were profiting off of it, I think there would be, you know, that's definitely not okay, you know. But
see, I don't know about that, right? Because we were talking earlier, or I was mentioning earlier, about like IP law being broken, right? So, just to de-jargonify, if anyone doesn't know, IP is short for intellectual property, right? So that's things like copyright, trademark, ways that people or brands maintain control over the products that are being put out in their name. And one of the big problems with copyright, and one of the ways that it is stifling music, in ways that AI might have interesting ramifications on, is the length of copyright, and not just in life but after death, is massive. You know, so Disney, again, not to vilify the mouse too much, please hit me up. I'd love to write for anything. But like Disney again is responsible for this. Like Steamboat Willie, who's the original design, original kind of mouse that Mickey grows out of, is only just coming into public domain this year.
Yeah.
Which is like close to a century, I believe, since its creation. Songs like Happy Birthday are still, I believe, not in public domain, having been...
No.
And you should fact check me on this, but I believe was acquired by Warner Chappell, and who's essentially continued lobbying to extend the lifetime of copyright and IP so that they can continue to profit from songs like that legitimately should be public domain and fair use, is one of the reasons that it is so hard to innovate. Because, I mean, I guess this is the thing. I think when you're dead, especially, I mean, if you die early, it is a little different. But like when you're dead, I think you're dead. I don't think that your kids should get to profit off your art unless they are minors. Like,
okay.
Because...
Okay, yeah. Why?
Because that... I mean, I'm big on the death of the author, right? Authorial intention. Once you put artworks out into the world, they are no longer wholly yours, right?
True.
You can control their copyright, and you should have the right to, because you need to monetize that as an option in order to incentivize the creation of good art.
Yeah.
Or not, it's not required, but it makes that system much more functional and accessible to people. Which I think AI tools could also do, right? Lower the barriers to entry. But at the same time, but while you can exploit that copyright, art is the sum of its properly justified interpretations. Which is why artists can be like wrong about their creations all the time. But once an artwork is out there, it's out, and like people can use it. This is a thought I had earlier, actually, is specifically about the ghostwriter thing. One of the better parts of IP law is statutory rights. So you don't need permission from an artist to cover their song. And that is correct because, again, because of that idea of like public ownership of art belonging to the world and to the community.
Yeah.
But what statutory rights do is say, okay, you don't need their permission unless it's transformative, in which case, then you're into a different area of IP law. But if it's not particularly transformative, you just have to pay a set rate. And I think that's also quite a feasible solution for stuff like using the voice of people like Kurt Cobain, right? If you're not going to say that copyright is void on death or the seniority of the children, whichever comes later, well, that's not quite the right setup, but I think you know what I mean. Then a good interim would be to say, okay, well, you can use Kurt Cobain's voice as much as you like.
Yeah.
But for every minute that you use it or whatever it is, you must pay X amount to his estate, or whatever percentage of money you make from that commercialized venture. Like this percentage has to go to the Cobain estate or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And it has to be publicized. You must note, in the same way as YouTube has in their volunteer agreement, that it is not Kurt Cobain himself singing, that it is an AI digitized representation.
Yes, definitely. Okay. It's an interesting one. This is slightly off piece from AI, but building off something you were saying, which I will tie back into a sec with the AI conversation, but thought it's worth bringing up. The idea of the death of the author, how that ties into this whole AI conversation. I don't know if what I'm about to propose is an idea, and I have a few kind of wild idea statements to throw at you.
Hit me.
Some of them to do with AI. This one, not so much, but we will get there. So the idea of the death of the author, when you put a work out into the world, the idea that it no longer belongs to you, it belongs to the mass consciousness, right? I believe there should be some governmental system involved for every mass market piece of media that's released. Upon its release, that version should be taken and put into what I call the culture vault. Okay. And this would be, for every country in the world, essentially. Everyone would have to agree to it and sign up to it. So things like the original Star Wars.
Yeah, I knew this. That I'm coming for the mouse and you're coming for Lucas.
Yeah, I'm coming for But the idea that original film may never be seen again out of a couple of crappy videotapes, lurking in a basement somewhere, that's a tragedy, because that is a memory that belongs to a lot of people that they won't be able to get back. But I feel like there should be some system involved that catalogues these things and keeps them, so that they're not lost to time. What do you think of that idea? Do you think that's crazy, or do you know of anything of that ilk that exists?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's tough because I think creators should have the opportunity to revisit their work. I can't see a good argument against that, but I don't think that also entails their right to scrub the previous work, the original work, from existence. Which is one of the biggest problems of Lucas's methodology, right? And it's not just that. There are all sorts of ways and implications that this kicks in. The amount of content that, because it exists only digitally, is completely deleted. Like streaming services are one example. And when you have access to a streaming service that theoretically anything could disappear and you wouldn't have a permanent copy. But then there are also things like iTunes, or places where you can purchase what should be, when you purchase, that should not be an indefinite rental, right? That is a nonsense concept from a legal perspective, right? That's why I also think we should probably abolish leasehold as a landholding concept, but that's a whole other kettle of landlords.
Kettle of landlords.
Yes.
It's a great band name.
Well, someone's going to talk about that being where they belong, and I don't want to go down that road. But the question of what it means to own a thing, both as a creator but also as a purchaser, right? That is, because of digital stuff, more up in the air than ever, which is, again, pulls us back to AI, because the legal precedent has been established, not tested, I believe, at this point in court, but has been, well, actually, that's not true, has been tested somewhat in court, but not finalized in court. The US Copyright Office, on several occasions, rejected a artwork that its proposer claimed had been entirely created by his own AI art generator, without specific input for this picture from him. And the Copyright Office 3 times, and then at least one appeals court, ruled that the Copyright Office were correct to reject the possibility of copyright, because copyright, as currently constituted in US law, requires human authorship. And so there is this kind of, if AI is one of the biggest barriers to its musical use as well, is that if AI can't create copyrightable works, what is that going to do to both intellectual property and creative industries, like music industry or the visual arts industries or like the film industry, because it's not going anywhere. It's only going to get more and more prevalent. And so either a like pretty major change in IP law, which is so overdue at this point. Again, happy birthday, still not public domain. Either that is going to have to happen, or AI. Like, what I mean, yeah, I don't really see another like copyright law as it is cannot exist with AI creation, and I don't think AI creation is going anywhere. And so copyright law is going to have to change. But the problem is the government is not agile. I know that's business speak, but it is the truth that like liberal democracies are the best worst system we have, but they are slow decision makers compared to most other forms of government. And not just that, but and again, this is especially a problem in the US, which is the heart of most of the legal issues here. But especially in the US, they are so old that they do not understand even the premises of the predecessors to the technology that has been discussed. And they are hard to educate even on those things, let alone to get to a level of education where they can effectively legislate. So yeah, like IP law is always changing, but a wholesale change has got to come.
Yeah, so this ties very much into my big statement idea. So I want to pitch you the next 50 years, essentially, broadly speaking, in terms of music. And I didn't realise this conversation would venture into copyright so much, but I guess it is a big part of it. But one of the big things I was thinking about is how is AI going to change music as a whole, with how the artist kind of participates in it. What level will there be an artist anymore? And so my idea was thinking, okay, eventually the battle with AI will be won and AI will win. At some point this will happen. I don't know quite how it's going to happen, but it's not going anywhere. It's such a big technology, and I don't know what needs to change about it or needs to change about law or people, but it's going to break through. That's my feeling, and I have very mixed feelings about that, because I think most art out there should be generated by people and not by an artificial intelligence. However, this is one possible future. So the idea is 50 years from now, musicians will be quite rare. If you know someone that can even play an instrument at a basic level, that will be a rarity. You know, at the moment, most people know someone who can strum a chord, a guitar, or maybe even know someone who's a bit more involved with it. But I think in the future it'll be quite rare, because I think AI tools will get to a point where you will be able to tell an AI, and I imagine you can do a version of it now, but the tool will be more advanced. You can say to an AI, you know, I just broke up with my girlfriend and my heart is shattered. And I just really, I want to listen to a song, you know, I want like a real punk rock, angry song, you know, that captures the way I feel. And can you put these elements into it? And so the AI will then, you know, or create the song for you. And because it will be linked to your social media accounts and your messengers, it will be able to, you know, take details from these things about your relationship and integrate them into the lyrics. It will be able to do crazy things. So within 5-10 minutes, you will get this song, and it could be absolutely heartbreaking to listen to, you know, depending on the level of direction that you give the AI. You know, I think that's what will come down to it. There will be people in the future who would consider themselves an artist, but they don't know how to play an instrument. They don't know how to create a melody. They have no musical skill, but they're able to describe what they want to hear. That will become a whole new skill
Yes.
in the music world. And whole songs will be born of that. And it makes me think that in the future, that these people who've created the song, but not really, using the AI, will hold very little control over that creation, and that actually it will be the AI programmers, the company behind the AI, that will control the copyright and control the royalties of that song. So that song that they created, that punk rock heartbreak song, gets uploaded online and it becomes a big deal and lots of people love it. Well, then it is the company behind it that profit off of it. If we get to a point where, you know, you can make money off of an AI song, you know, if the copyright laws are sorted out for it. And I think musicians will actually be slightly more valued in this time if it happens in this dystopian future I'm describing. But
see, I guess that's the thing, is that I understand why you view that as dystopian.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for clarity, like, the part of the sort of idea of this podcast came out of a conversation that Scott and I had before, where I think that the central difference that came to light from our conversation is that for you, art is about process.
Yes.
And for me, art is about product. I think that both perspectives are valid, because, again, art is the sum, and here I'm talking sort of meta conceptually, but art is still the sum of its properly justified interpretations. Like, art is about what it does for us, but the parts that do what for us can vary from, like, person to person.
Yeah.
Like, within your scenario, I think the democratization of the creative process is a net benefit, right? The fact that there will be this whole set of people, yeah. And again, in the same way that all of the AI debate happens within the broader context of the Industrial Revolution and the general impacts of technology and the cyclical natures of those conversations as old jobs and ways of doing things die and new ones thrive. Like, these are the same conversations that were being had about DJs and electronic drums and various developments that we've had in music history, right? I think it's great that there will be people who can say, hey, yeah, like Girl Talk, but without the even having to do the actual stuff. Mash me up all of these songs, and their ability to conceptualize will be sufficiently great as to raise their sort of artistic and commercial viability, right? I think that is a bonus. I think the idea that the corporation would take 100% of that, like, I think there's a reasonable argument for a 50-50 split there. Like, if you are the creator, but the tool is required to do X amount of the work, I think, yeah, certainly from an IP law perspective.
See, I think this is a thing where there'll be several different sites that give you a different split. You know, how there is now with different streaming sites where they'll give you 0.0006 pence, and then another one will give you 0.0026
But
pence.
that's not just about the sites, right? Like, the same thing is true of producers. There are producers that would take higher points than others or higher fees than others, and the ratios for that might be different. But there are producers that think, and many of them with good reason, that their fingerprints on a song are deserving of a greater percentage, right?
Yeah.
And especially in a data-driven world like AI will be operating in, they should, and whether they will or not is a very different question, but they should be able to evidence the value of any given model over another by saying, well, look, this is the output that our users have, etc. compared to these other models. So that's why we justify this higher percentage. But yeah, like provided that the law changes to accommodate the copyrightability of AI generated works, then the remaining question is really the same one that the Copyright Office is using to refuse, which is that what level of human input is required for us to consider a thing to be human derived, right? It's one of the frequent criticisms of AI art generators specifically is that at a kind of a really reductive bad faith representation of the argument, but a lot of people just say it doesn't make you an artist to type in a prompt. But prompts are an art form in and of themselves, or at least a highly technical skill. The ability to get AI to do what you want, at least at the moment, and this will probably no longer be true when AI becomes sufficiently good at reading human intention. But currently is so much more complex than most of these people realize. It's not, you don't just go to a place and say, show me this thing, especially if the thing that you have is very specific, right? But similar to, not AI, but with animals, right? There's the famous, I forget the exact species, but the ape selfie, right? It's, is it a gibbon? No, it's not a gibbon. Anyway, whichever
was
ape
it,
is.
who does the copyright belong to?
Yes.
Is it the person who owns the camera, or is it the zoo? Or,
Exactly.
Yeah.
But basically this photographer set up a camera, and then a monkey came along and took a selfie of themselves with the camera. And so it's one of the things that the Copyright Office considered, and this is like, humans, when they take a photo, they select the composition. They select the object and the subject and the background and the framing. And to me, it seems that is not sufficiently distinguished in kind from creating a prompt, right? Whether that be for art or for the, not to say that, like, hey, AI generator, I'm feeling sad because I had this breakup, mash me together these, like, make me something that reflects my sadness, right? I think I'd actually, the idea of it filling in details from your life as equal parts kind of amazing and terrifying.
Yeah. And things it would have just, overheard, through your phone, microphone, etc., that it's documented about you. That sort of stuff is wild.
Yeah. But, like, make me a sad song to reflect how I feel. That for me is not, you're not really directing the prompt. There's not sufficient specificity in that to make you an artist. But AI, play 10 seconds of this song and then 5 seconds of this song and then 10 seconds of this, like, that level of control, for me, that would qualify as art, because literally, again, that's what Girl Talk is doing, but with fewer steps, right?
Okay.
And so the line sits somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
But where exactly that is, again, that's what I was saying earlier. That's IP law and most law that will end up being decided ad hoc on a case-by-case basis by hopefully qualified professionals.
Yeah. So one aspect of AI that I'm really interested in as a songwriter is how it would study, say, a certain song. If you were to say, can you make me a song like so-and-so artist, how it studies them, what elements it takes away, what data it extracts from it. Because that that's something that I do as an artist. So one of my favorite songs is a song by a band called The Walkmen. Have you heard of The Walkmen?
I don't believe so.
They had a song in the mid 2000s called The Rat, and I'll link you to it later. It was very much during the kind of garage rock, indie rock explosion of the kind of the early to mid 2000s. And this song, to me, every time I listen to it, and I listen to it maybe every month, it sounds like teenage angst, more so than any song I've ever heard. And one thing I do when I listen to it, I kind of try to feel like the song is surrounding me, and like because it just has this thing where it grabs onto you and it shakes you. And I want to know more about how that works and how they managed that thing. And I just wonder if I would love to see the AI's actual physical process of what is extracting from it, so I could go, okay, that's how I need to deconstruct a song, because there's ways to do it as a musician. There's melody and there's rhythm and there's everything like that. But then there's also this other very human thing of there's this kind of magic to it that those 5 members of the band just bring, that it's kind of hard to put your finger on as well. But is there a way to like quantify that kind of that musical magic beyond just all the separate little elements?
Yeah, I mean, this is the origin of Pandora, right, as a radio. So Pandora radio station began its life as, and I believe this is what it was called when it started, because I joined very early, the Music Genome Project. And it was a specific mission to deconstruct and codify the elements of what makes songs and establish the commonality across the known body of music in order to generate an algorithm essentially that would do what a Spotify recommended playlist does, which is understand what it is about songs that makes them particularly powerful to particular people, right? It's very hard, even if you have the education and the language to understand the psychology there, right? I am a complete sucker for a 6/8. It is, I think, comfortably my favorite time signature.
Interesting.
And I think that is to do with the inherent swing within a 6/8.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's in some ways easier to dance to because of like the feel of that sway than a 4/4 will be, because 6/8 also has a kind of probably less tempo variation because of that swing. Like there's a smaller band of BPMs where it will really function.
Yeah.
But it's not like you can just shove on any song that's 6/8 and I will suddenly be engaged, right? There are songs that could tick 100 boxes for me and still wouldn't do it, because art is a really complex thing to define and understand. I mean, I mentioned earlier my philosophy degree, right? My thesis for that degree was on whether video games could be artworks. One of the things that I had to do in order to make that argument, because obviously they are, and luckily at this point, very few people are denying that, but this was 2008, and it was still very much a subject of debate at the time. But one of the things that I had to do was to create a sufficient definition of art. And the problem with doing that is that it is essentially impossible. And so the definition that I was eventually drawn to is what's known as cluster theory. So within philosophy, there are you can have conditions that are necessary, which is to say something cannot be within this category unless it has this characteristic. And then there are things that are sufficient conditions. So having this characteristic is enough to make this thing a part of this group, right? So necessary and sufficient. And the problem with defining art is there are no conditions that are either necessary or sufficient, right? There is no single thing that you can point to say that makes a thing art. And so the solution, like cluster theory, is essentially, I mean, the TLDR version is you know it when you see it. But the kind of more convoluted thing is it is a cluster of conditions, all of which are neither necessary nor sufficient, but which a sufficiently large grouping of constitutes membership of that category, right? And I think about that a lot in sort of in the context of art in general, but also in the context of understanding music and understanding those elements and how things can be more than the sum of their parts. Because decoding what makes a song work is a skill that producers get paid a shit ton of money. Sorry, I don't know, I swear. A lot of money.
That's okay.
Bleep. Bleep. Get paid a lot of money to do, and for good reason. Because, like, even the people that do it don't necessarily understand how they know, right? Like, I've produced a fair few, like, things over the years, and a lot of people come to me for advice on, like, sculpting songs and things like that, and I don't really know, like, even as much as I think about myself and how my brain works and my process. If you ask me, like, how do you know that this thing should be there, or like that progression is a pre-chorus progression rather than that, and there isn't, like, there is no science. I mean, or maybe there is, and we just haven't got there yet. And that is the sort of thing that AI will be particularly good at, is that it's great at taking large data sets and breaking them down to understand their constituent parts and the patterns between them. Because maybe there is, like, some magical formula of, if there's a song that has all of these elements and none of these elements, Jimmy will love it and it'll be work 100 times. And if AI can give me that algorithm, please, I'm all about it. Like, improve my listening habits. Like, be better than my Discover Weekly, because I mean, it's a low bar, but like, that is it's one of the great kind of openings for AI is mass data analysis and rote task replacement, and that's why things like, I think it's why things like Lyria are, which is, again, the thing that prompted our discussion that led to process versus product. That's why I think things like Lyria are more controversial, because they're doing neither of those things, right? Unless you consider the process of making music to be rote, which I think I probably do a lot more than you do, right? But yeah.
This is interesting, because it's the next topic I want to jump on.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about what you mentioned earlier. You mentioned the idea that we stand on different sides of the fence with a song. So for me, the art is in the process, and for you, the art is in the product. And I wanted to explain my stance on that a little bit, just for the listener. So when we were having this conversation a few weeks ago, I kind of, essentially what I was trying to articulate was that for me, the process of writing a song is the most artistic part of the song, more so than the finished product. I feel closer to a song that I'm halfway through writing than a song that I've been playing live for years, and I could sing and play with my eyes closed. Even though that song is a part of me in a different way, I feel closer to the song that is halfway through being written, and it's still kind of, I'm still chiseling it out of a big chunk of marble and still trying to figure out what it is that I'm getting out of it. You know, to me, that is the real joy of the process. And when it's done, there's a certain level of sadness for me that it's kind of gone and it's out into the world. You know, I'm happy that it's going to take on a new life and people interpret songs in different ways, and that's awesome. But I am sad that I'm no longer shaping it. You know, it's kind of almost like a weird parental kind of thing.
But like art is your baby, right? And people talk about that for good reason. I see. It's interesting because I think, firstly, I have to wonder whether there is some recency bias in there, right? Like the new thing that you've just made is. I think it's perfectly understandable from a psychological perspective why that is the thing that you feel sort of closer to, because usually, probabilistically, when you create that thing, it's about something you're currently feeling or experiencing, right?
Yeah.
But it's one of the interesting facets. You know, like I've been writing songs since I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
So that is uncomfortably close to 3 decades of songwriting now. And it's one of the fascinating parts of that. And while I have some sympathy for like your REMs who refuse to play their kind of big hits, because I'm not that I've ever had any big hits, but I've been there when you're burned out on a song. But like songs also are cyclical, and your relationship with them it develops over time. There are songs that like you love when you write them, and you fall out of love with, and you fall back in love with later, or songs you write about one situation, and then years later you see them through a different lens, and they suddenly take on a whole new kind of life and meaning. And so. And like kind of that's my point about authorial intention, right? Is you thought you were writing about this thing, but that is you at that moment, right? And I get this also comes back to the process product, like whether you are writing and creating for yourself or for others, right? And those others can be you in 20 years' time, right? But I think I understand the value of process for kind of authenticity in the product, right? And it is one of the more kind of difficult aspects of AI, and something that we covered before is the more that processes are automated, the more divorced people become from the process and the less they understand it, right? Like cars are sufficiently complicated now that very few people do their own mechanic work, right? We'd rather just take it out. But at the same time, this year I changed, an embarrassing thing to admit probably at 37 years old, but I changed my first tire ever because I was like, how complex can this be, right? But the more divorced people get from that understanding of how the things that they rely on work, the more it is easy, like for the well, not just for like standards to drop, right? But I'm not that even that's necessarily happening in the automotive sector, but the more easy it is for them to be taken advantage of, and that could happen in like an AI co-writing context, right? Like you're sort of talking about. But also the less control they can exercise over the final product, right? And you're right, if you are not giving specific instructions because possibly you don't even have the language or the understanding to do so, then you are leaving a lot in the hands of the AI. But again, I'll make the producer comparison because that's still very true of many producers working with many musicians. And let me be clear, there are producers I've refused to work with in the past because they have a disparaging view of singers as being not musicians. Singers are definitely musicians, but it's also true that singers who are just singers often lack the musical vocabulary to explain to producers and musicians what they want from a song, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of your job as a co-writer. It's one of the things I love most, again, about the process of creation, but also about the product is I've spent a long time helping people say what they want to say.
Yeah.
And I can do that with a human context. But like, I think AI will eventually get to similar levels where maybe it's literally reading parts of your brain. Maybe it's analyzing your kind of sort of body or your heart rate or, any number of things. Or it knows your personal history in the same way that you posited earlier. But it's not like it isn't already the case that there are people making good professional money in music who are that divorced from the process, right?
Yeah.
So I think that the two things can exist side by side. I think the ratios may change, and we should probably put guardrails in place and regulations in order to make sure that the way that that ratio changes and the way that IP law works going forward is balanced and fair between competing interests. But I don't think it's a wholesale change. I think it's a degree, a difference in degree rather than a difference in kind.
Yeah, I mean, a previous podcast I did here in the Weekend Rockstars with my co-host Billy Deadman was what makes a good musician, and we kind of explored the subject and we talked about a lot of different experiences we'd had, things that we'd found uncomfortable in the past working with some people, not naming specific examples, but we went deep into it, and what we eventually came up with was actually finding a way to clearly communicate your idea, whether it is in musical terms or not. That was what we came to in the end. Do you think that's kind of do you think that's fair? As a musician, it's being able to clearly communicate your idea, even if you don't necessarily know all the musical terms, because you are a very musically literate person.
Well, I mean, no, thank you, but I should hope so, given the amount of time and money that's been spent on making me just that.
Yeah, so working with someone who's not quite as musically literate as yourself,
which I do all the time, but
which you do all the time.
Yeah, but I guess that's the thing for me is like, I think it's a valuable skill for musicians to have, but I don't think it's the defining like characteristic or quality of a musician. Is because especially again, we're principally talking about vocalists in this context, right? Because most instrumentalists or non-vocal instrumentalists need to learn at least a modicum of theory or vocabulary in order to communicate and like learn in the first place. But singing is a thing that is so natural and available to everyone, even at wildly differing skill levels, that that you can do it just through pure kind of mimicry and echolalia and that kind of stuff. And so it is the place where you're most likely to encounter people that don't have that ability to communicate to you as a co-writer or a producer or whatever it might be, what it is that, I mean, they will use woolly words like, can you make it more grey? Or can you make it more like ethereal, stuff like that. And obviously the more descriptive people be and the more context you have, the better you know them, the easier it is to kind of decipher what they're talking about and say, well, okay, well actually what they mean is they want like more in the treble here, and they want kind of a minor melodic progression or whatever it might be. But I think I've known and worked with too many people who don't have who are using that levels of terminology and can't really point at the things that they want, but who I would still think, oh no, this person, like, I've seen their ability to communicate with an audience, right? Like, maybe they can't speak to me, but when they're interpreting lyrics and melody, like, their musicianship is simply not in question. So I think, that I don't have like a again another succinct non-cluster theory like black and white definition for what makes someone like a sort of great musician. And like that, communication is important and valid, and certainly makes it much easier for the people that you are working with, right? I mean, we have this even sometimes, like in rehearsals for the Tokyo Sex Worlds, because I primarily, and this was the case even before I went to Belmont and lived in Nashville, I primarily think about music in the Nashville number system. I think about it as patterns. I think about it as numbers.
Okay.
And there have often been times where like that's my go-to description for how to do a thing, right? But other people who are much more classically trained, they're thinking in letters or in other ways. And so even amongst sort of trained people, like that communication can be difficult or problematic.
Yeah. How did you find those rehearsals? Did you find them difficult?
No, I mean, like,
annoying.
The guys were great. You were great. Like it was genuinely such a pleasure to be asked and to be involved. And the wedding was a good time, even if we had some technical issues that we soldiered through pretty well, I thought.
We soldiered through.
It was good, and it was. I think it's also illustrative of something for me. As someone who, I'm quite interested in the psychology and the physicality of music as well, right? Last year, I think it was, sort of start of last year, I applied for a master's degree in music therapy, and did a fair amount of like reading up on music as medicine and things like that as well. And obviously, that's what I do in my daily work, but there are all sorts of things in the human experience of music that I think AI, certainly for the foreseeable future, will struggle to replicate. So the fact that when musicians enter the pocket together, when they are properly in sync, their heartbeats and their pulses tend to synchronize.
Yeah.
Also the case for large crowds of people at festivals when they're all listening to the same songs. There is something both material and intangible that happens when you put musicians in a room that AI is yet to kind of codify. And if it gets there, maybe we will all be obsolete. Who knows?
Yeah, it's the question when AI takes a physical form and whether you can have, train an AI to master a certain instrument or learn your back catalogue, and then they take a mobile platform in some humanoid body that you can then have come on stage with you. I mean that sounds crazy, but back in the 90s, as a child thinking of AI, I didn't think that'd ever be a real thing. And now we've just done a whole podcast on it.
But see, like that makes me go, like what I want to do now is kind of reverse Chuck E. Cheese. I want my fully trained songwriting co-partner AI that's listened to like my 600 plus songs and my 1,000 plus voice notes and knows all of that, and I want to sit on its lap like a ventriloquist dummy because it's 8 feet tall and I'm just there playing, but it's like it's puppeting me and I'm just the tool that's like singing out. I think as a visual on stage, but like it would be, I think there is, like, there's so much room for creative exploration of what this means, of what our relationship with AI can be. It's one of the fascinating elements. I watched a UNESCO video on the ethics of AI. And kind of one of the things that it instilled in me, is like ethics should be the tool that innovates, rather than stifling, should be enabling innovation, right? But innovation that's kind of well directed. And there are so many ways that AI can empower us. Lyria, for example, which again is one of the things that sparked this conversation. So Lyria is Google DeepMind's new tool that is not yet publicly available, but I think if it is as good as the demos make it seem, and that's always a big caveat, chunk of salt the size of your head, I think I will probably pay for it and use it. But Lyria is essentially being able to kind of whistle in or hum in or sing in and then specify via essentially prompts, right? Like, oh, make this a sax solo is what they use in the video, or make this a whatever, right? That for me will empower my creativity, because the block that I have is always, is almost always my ambition. It's like, well, I need a full orchestra for this thing, and I can't make one that sounds sufficiently good in an amount of time in my room to make that investment worthwhile. But if I can get AI to do that for me in 10 seconds, sure, I don't know what the process is, but legitimately, if I get deep enough into that I'm like, I want more control than the AI gives me, I can go and learn that process, and I will already have proof of concept, ideally at that point, that the idea is worth investing that kind of time and possibly money into. But, B, that I can, move from conception to production in the blink of an eye, essentially, rather than that being such a bottleneck in the process like it currently is.
Okay. So we're going to conclude the podcast very soon, but one element I'm bringing into this new Weekend Rockstars kind of era is I want to find out a little bit about each musician's process of writing songs as they come on. Now we've touched on it a little bit, and we've talked about AI. So this is kind of separate to the AI's kind of epilogue. But one thing I'd love to know is about your process of how you write a song. Whether there are different ways that you go about it. What are the unique fun things that Jimmy does to write a song?
I mean, without spilling all the secrets of my excessively expensive education, it depends a lot, right? So if you're co-writing, for me, because again, like I said, my job as a co-writer is more often than not, especially when you're working with vocalists, to help people say what they are trying to say, right? And so then I'm usually taking direction from them. Like, one of the sort of proudest moments for me, and one of the most emblematic of that, and I'll probably check with him before this goes out to make sure we don't have to cut this out of the podcast, but I think he'd be comfortable talking about it. I used to work with a guy called Andrew Muir, who was famous for he was known as the singing plumber. He got to the finals of X Factor in, I think it would have been sometime in the mid 2000s, maybe 2008. But during that process, very sadly, his I believe it was his niece died of something tragic, some sort of illness, brain cancer, I believe. And one day he just came to me, and he had basically 2 sides of A4, just filled with all of his kind of thoughts and emotions, and we just sat down and turned that piece of paper into a full song, like, and it was such an obvious catharsis for him, and it was so, like, being able to empower and enable that for him felt so good for me. It's one of the things that music is exceptional at doing. But like, when you're co-writing, you have to take your cue really. Even if you're like equals, you've got to find, you've got to come to some kind of working arrangement. When I'm writing by myself, it can be anything. Like, sometimes I start with lyrics, sometimes I start with melody, sometimes I start with progression, sometimes I start with just a rhythm. Most of them go onto my phone as voice notes and sit there for years or sometimes a decade or more, and then eventually become, the small percentage of them that are lucky enough to be selected go on to become stuff. But like, I'm a very thematic writer, so I tend to like to know, what am I writing about? I tend to be quite lyrically focused, certainly more than many writers. But it's one of the interesting elements, technical elements that I picked up from my songwriting degree, is the value of, I didn't really have, again, more language, more vocabulary to describe stuff, but the value of prosody, which is making sure that the stress of words falls naturally where it would. So that means in a musical context that the melody, the stresses in the melody match the stresses of the colloquial way of speaking the word, right? And you'll know when it's not happened because you can hear that the emphasis is on the wrong syllable, right? Like, as the classic thing. But sometimes you'll hear people crowbar a lyric in to make that work. Yeah, I even had it in an old song of mine that I revisited the other day. So like, I like to make that work. But so you have the kind of melodic value and the lyrical value. But when you're writing lyrics, and this is the thing, again, having slagged them off earlier, I will give props to the Beatles for this, because they're a band that genuinely understands this. Like, a lot of the sort of Oasis or shoegaze stuff comes from this, which is that lyrics also have, independent of their meaning, a pure acoustic quality.
Yes.
So songs like I Am the Walrus, right, that is all about exploring that kind of acoustic quality. It's like, well, this melody, I want to hear like this kind of sound. Like an E sound doesn't work here. It's like going to be an U sound or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That is a really important and under kind of valued element of writing, is not just what do the lyrics mean, but how do the lyrics sound?
How do they sound? Yeah, I mean, that is a big thing for me. I always want the sound of the words to have a certain flavour and taste to them, and that is something I've always emphasised. And when other people don't get that idea, that is a frustrating thing, I mean,
again, people make a lot of money never caring about prosody in their lives. So,
there you go.
Different strokes, but
there you go. Jimmy, it's been a blast talking to you today. We've had some very interesting conversations about AI. And
thank you for putting up with my info dumping.
You've got some great things to say.
I used legitimately 5% of my research.
Where can people find you online?
You can find me various places. I'm on Facebook. My record label that is the output for all of my music is Sound and Image. That is Image as in Jimmy spelled backwards, so YMMIJ. You can also go to soundandimage.com, will take you to the same place, or jimmykent.com, that takes you to my performance page. But yeah, I'm bad at promotions, so yeah, there'll be some stuff out there, but if there are specific things you want, just prod me. My DMs are wide open. And you can regularly find me at the Grizzly down in Sunbury on Wednesday nights for Live with Pride, which is the open mic. I'm probably there more or less every other week, although not so much recently because it's a long December.
There we go.
But thank you for having me, man.
Oh,
it's been a pleasure.
Been a blast. Cheers.